Hey everybody, and thank you so much for being here. We are talking about our very first unit, which is about what memory is. So trying to get to the bottom of that question turns out is going to be a little bit harder than it sounds. You could probably go on Wikipedia, just type in, memory, and it'll give you some definition of memory. But one thing that I thought was interesting is this past summer, I was reading a textbook on memory published by Alan Baddeley and Michael Einsink, two fellas that you're going to see their names again over the semester because they're kind of big names in the field. But I was really surprised that in the first chapter, they talk a lot about memory, but they never define it. And so what I want us to kind of start with is to just simply brainstorm what you think a good definition of memory might be. The closest that textbook comes to that is saying something along the lines that memory, and you don't need to write this down, this is just because I'm trying to illustrate it, that memory is storing past experiences. That's kind of the I'm sorry that my handwriting is going to be bad. It's going to be bad all semester. I apologize. But that's the closest that they come to a quick definition for what memory is. But the reason why they give that definition is simply so they can say that, as we're going to see, that what memory is much more complicated than what this might offer us. We'll talk about what is and what isn't memory a little bit today, or at least be thinking about that. And we'll talk a little bit about this flow chart. So this flow chart that you see right here, we're going to be talking about this all semester. We're starting right here. But if you looked at the syllabus and the course calendar, you'll see that we're going to be talking about this piece for a whole chapter. We're going to be talking about this piece for a whole chapter. We're going to be talking about this piece for a whole chapter. And depending on how you define it, we might be talking about this one too. So basically, we're going to kind of run through what all this means by the end of this unit, so that way you kind of have an idea of what is in store for you for this semester. So let's get into it. So what is memory? I think that, and if if we were having class right now, if you were in front of me, I'd probably ask this out loud and then pause for a good 2 minutes, let the awkward silence fill the room, and then somebody says something like, I don't know, memory is the ability to store and retrieve previous information. And I would say, okay, that's a great definition, but what does it mean to retrieve information? What does it mean to store information? And you can quickly see that memory as a definition becomes very tricky, because you have to define all these other things to define this. But even more than that, memory is going to shift a lot depending on what kind of information you're talking about, or what kind of experiences you're talking about. So are we talking about a memory for something you had during childhood, or a memory for something that happened yesterday? Or are we talking about remembering how something sounds, remembering how something tastes? Are those different than trying to remember what you did yesterday? I don't know. That's one of the things we're going to be looking at this semester. But the quick answer is that yes, that those things are memory, but that they are different, that they behave differently in the brain. So I want you to think about, how would you describe memory to a 5-year-old? Exercises like this are always kind of fun, because I feel like if you really want to get to know a subject, you need to be able to kind of explain it clearly and simply. So I'm not going to give you this definition yet, but I want you to kind of be thinking about it as I show you a couple of examples in just a few moments, and then contrast that with how would you define it for a more scholarly crowd. Are those two things different? All right, so let's go through a couple of examples of what memory is. This is the first time I generally try not to embed videos into these lectures, because they never work, But I'm going to try it out. Hopefully it works, so we can go through a couple of these examples.
A conditioned taste aversion can occur when an organism ingests something that makes them ill. For example, Susan here has a conditioned taste aversion to mushu pork. So Susan, how does that make you feel?
Oh gosh. I feel like I might want to vomit, and I'm salivating, and I don't like it at all.
I'm sorry, I'll put it down. Susan's nausea and sickness is paired with the sight, the smell, and the taste of the food. So from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. We should try to avoid things in the future that have made us ill. So sorry, Susan, that was just a little payback for Tickles the Snake.
I forgive you.
Okay, all right. And then the rest of the video gets a little bit corny because it's so scripted. But is this memory? So I think this is a fun example because they never use the word memory, right? They never use that word here. And in fact, a lot of this sounds like maybe your learning class. If you took learning with Dr. Reyes or Dr. Andrade, that's what this is, right? This is just classical conditioning. However, is it memory where you eat something, you get sick, and then years later, whenever you smell that food, your body automatically feels kind of sick just by smelling it? Is that a form of memory? I will let you think about that. And I'm going to do that for all of these, by the way. I'm not going to give you a concrete answer. I want you to think critically about it, and then we'll revisit some of these ideas and see if that helps. All right. So what about this video?
Does everybody dream? I had a dream where I was flying, like I hit the wall. A lot of times I have scary dreams, and sometimes I have dreams about wrestlers. I sleep with a teddy bear or a rabbit.
All right, cool. Looks like the video froze up because, like I said, anytime you try to embed videos in a PowerPoint, it never works whenever you're teaching, right? So you got a little snippet of this. We weren't going to watch all 8 minutes of it anyways, but these kids are talking about their dreams, right? Is that a memory? Is that a memory that they are recalling some information that never actually happened, right? So even if we wanted to use that really quick and dirty definition of a memory is storing a previous experience, would a dream count if it's not something that actually happened to you, if it's something that happened while you're sleeping? All right, let's look at another example. Oh, this is my favorite example. This is an example, as the title suggests, of some slime mold solving a maze. So, if I wanted to, and I initially thought, oh, I'm going to show the students, I'm going to show y'all an example of a rat solving a maze. But you already know that a rat can solve a maze, right? And if it solves it faster and faster and faster, we might conclude that they are remembering something about it. Maybe which turns to take or what directions get you to the end fastest. But this is an example of slime mold. So you can see some slime mold has been deposited in here, and the goal is to get essentially from this point over here all the way to this point over here. So if I'm solving this as an animal, I'm like, oh, nope, can't do it over here. Oh, sorry, it's over here and then over here. Those are the stop and the beginning and ending. So let's watch the slime maze do its dirty work as it kind of grows and grows and grows. It's disgusting, right? But surely a piece of fungus like this slime mold, surely it doesn't have memory, right? It doesn't have a central nervous system. And we would think that you would need a central nervous system or a brain in order to have a memory. And so I'm going to fast forward this a little bit. It's disgusting, but it's kind of slow. You can just see it kind of moving around a little bit. And then by now, you can see a very definite trace. Sorry, my little magic wand. Okay, here we go. You can see how thick this line right here is. The shortest distance between these two pieces. Is that an example of memory? That it was able to reach out and connect across these different turns in the maze. Is that an example of memory? Maybe right now, maybe you're saying, I don't think it is. Maybe you're saying that you think that it is memory. I don't know. Think critically about it. All right, here is another example. This one I think will probably be maybe kind of easy. Maybe not. Let's see what happens. This kid's going to try to solve a world record for Rubik's Cube. Let's see how he does. Alright, I love this kid over here who's like photobombing. Alright, so in this case, this guy was able to solve the Rubik's Cube in 10 seconds, right? And then check out this guy's reaction. Yeah, sorry. Not very often you catch somebody's dreams collapsing in real time on camera. But some of you may think that this is memory, some of you may not, because what is it that he's memorizing? I don't know if he is memorizing anything, right? He's just looking at it, right? So what's going on here? That could be memory. We haven't really talked about the notion of motor memory, right? Like if you're trying to type something, you know exactly where your fingers are while you're typing. Is this an example of that? I don't know. This one I think is more impressive. We're going to see a younger kid do something similar, only this adorable little kid, I'm going to turn the volume down for this one. He's got his Rubik's Cube. He's looking at it. Can he solve it? I don't know, folks. I don't know, chat. Looks pretty easy. Sorry. It's of course it's going to lag while I'm trying to record something. Who knows why. So basically, as you might guess, or maybe you read up here, this kid's just looking at it, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at it, and then I'm going to fast forward. He's looking at it for over a minute now, just staring at it. Alright, let's see what he does. What's this? A blindfold? What's he doing? And he's off. He's running with it. So he's not even looking at the Rubik's Cube, as you can see, and yet maybe he will, maybe he won't solve it. I feel like it would be mean if he didn't actually solve it and I showed you this video. He's gonna solve it. And it's amazing, right? But this, I think, is maybe a more clear-cut example of memory because we saw him looking at it and then now he can't see it and he's trying to solve it with his eyes closed. So if his eyes are closed, he has to be maybe recalling something, right? He has to be remembering something about the initial layout of this cube. And now, there he is. Look at that. He doesn't even look that excited about it. What a cool operator. Alright, here is another example.
Babies are born with a set of reflexes critical for survival in the outside world. Some of these reflexes are so obvious you might not think to look for them, such as the breathing reflex or the eye blink reflex. Rooting is one of the most critical reflexes. By touching 4-week-old Lily's cheek, she'll turn her head and open her mouth in preparation for nursing. Once the baby is in contact with a breast, a bottle, or even a finger, the sucking reflex takes over. Involuntary at first, the neonate will gradually gain control over sucking during the first year. Placing liquid in the mouth will induce the swallowing reflex.
In the first few weeks of life, it takes all the baby's concentration just to control these various uncoordinated reflexes. At this age, feeding Julia can take over an hour. After about 6 weeks, though, Julia will be a pro. There are other reflexes babies are born with that we don't completely understand. In the first 2 months, babies exhibit the stepping reflex. This is probably a precursor to walking. Watch Lily's toes fan out and curl. This is the Babinski reflex, which occurs when the bottom of a baby's foot is stroked.
You can also do like toes curling.
When pressure is placed on the baby's hand, you can see the grasping reflex at work.
Alright, I'm going to pause it there. Cute, adorable babies, right? So they were showing, was that an example of memory? I don't know. This one feels maybe a little bit different than the other videos. I want you to think about it. Alright, we got a couple more here. I'm not going to play too much of this one. I just wanted to show you an example of somebody playing a song, and I picked out a band from Northampton, a band I love called Speedy Ortiz, and playing their music is probably going to get this this video copyright infringement, but I don't care. So I can't hear it anyways.
We were the law school rejects, so we quarreled at the bar instead.
Alright, I'm going to mute it. So whenever this band is playing music, is memory involved? And if it is, to what degree is memory involved, right? She has to remember lyrics, so obviously that has memory, but what about all the other stuff that they're doing, right? Like, does memory play a role in that? I don't know. Alright, so here, and it doesn't just have to be Speedy Ortiz or some other band from Northampton, it can be any band, any musician, any artist that you can think of that is a musician. Is memory required there? Here is an example of non-humans. Shout out to all the non-humans watching this video right now. What parts of this do you think
and I are on our way
are
to make
memory?
a fire. We're interested in the origins of human culture and the origins of human mind. Not only do humans diverge because of language, but humans clearly diverge because of their ability to make a fire. And he really enjoys it. He's figured out how to use lighters and matches, a lighter properly. Put it on the fire. Yeah, put it down. I'll get the food in it. Hansi understands about traveling to different places, and he understands about what we're cooking in the fire. That's a perfect marshmallow stick. That's one of the best I've seen. Where's your marshmallow? It's not done. There, you got it burning. Can you put the fire out before we go? Whoops, you didn't take the top off. You forgot to take the top off. Save some for the fire.
Alright, so that monkey, his name is Kanzi. Kanzi, and that's Dr. Sue Savage Rumbaugh. She's worked with Kanzi for years and years. So in this case, we just saw this ape apparently go camping, right? Is that an example of memory? Can non-humans have memory? Can a monkey have a memory? We would think so, right? But do we have proof of that? Is this an example of that? Alright, so throughout all those videos, I would love to know what you think. And that's, the downside of having this online like this, is about which of those you think is memory and which of them isn't memory. And to be honest with you, I think there's maybe only one that isn't memory, or memory as I would define it. Actually, I didn't mean to do that. One second. If we go back to the reflexes, I don't think that the reflexes are an example of memory, but I think maybe all these others do involve memory to some degree. So when we talk about memory, when we try to define it, we need a definition that is going to encompass all of that. Not just, remembering what you did yesterday, but also remembering how things taste. Also remembering what we need to do. So remembering prospectively, remembering what we need to get from the grocery store would be an example of memory. A memory for something that hasn't even happened yet, something that we need to do. An example, speaking a language involves memory. Doing a Rubik's Cube or anything that involves motor memory, making music requires memory as well. So all of these things require memory. We need a definition that can capture all of that. And that is what kind of the first article that I am going to have you read this semester is about. Memory, an extended definition of those researchers really trying to wrestle with, okay, what is memory and how can we define it? Alright, so, and we're going to be doing this all semester. So one thing that I think is I tell people, when they ask, like what my specialty is in research, usually, I tell them memory. But if I'm talking with another cognitive psychologist, I will probably be much more specific than that. I'll probably say, oh, I study visual short-term memory and working memory. And the reason for that is because there are so many different types of memory that maybe I'm talking about a dream, or maybe I'm talking about motor memory, that we have to be very specific about what kind of memory we are talking about. And that might be just good practice for us to be thinking about whenever we're reading an article is, what type of memory is this? And we'll talk about what the different types of it are. This is a really early example, and I might even argue some of the very first data on memory ever collected scientifically. This is from Hermann Ebbinghaus. This is the guy that we are going to see next week. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German guy who was around, and if you don't know the history of psychology, especially experimental psychology, has a lot of roots in Germany. The first experimental psychology lab that studied behavior in a systematic scientific way came out of Germany. Ebbinghaus wasn't part of that lab, but he was, a few miles away, working at a different university than Edward Titchener. Don't get me started on this history stuff. I love talking about this history stuff, but we don't have time. But Ebbinghaus is maybe one of the first memory researchers ever, because he applied the scientific method and different experimental design to understand memory. And what you see here in this graph, I think it's safe to say we can call this memory. What are we looking at? We're looking at how much someone remembers about a list depending on when they were tested on it. So, for example, if they were tested literally as soon as they learned the list, their memory for that was about 100. So, and we can try this just now, if I ask you to remember this phone number, this number, try to remember that. Okay, now if I ask you to recall it right now, you'd probably do really good on it, right? Because there was no time spent between when you learned it versus when you were asked to retrieve that memory. But what Ebbinghaus found is something we're going to talk a lot about next week, or next unit, I should say, is how the length of that duration changes how much you remember. So if you get this number and then you have to wait a full hour, you can see that most people, that their accuracy drops down to about 40%, which is pretty embarrassing, right? They've forgotten most of that number already. Maybe they remember this piece, or maybe they remember this piece down here. And also, by the way, please don't call that number. It might be a family member, and maybe I should have chosen a random number instead of giving you their number. So don't text them. It's okay, because hey, what I just said is that an hour from now you won't even remember that number, so hey, that's nice. But what we can see and what Ebbinghaus found is that if you go from 1 hour to 8 hours, that accuracy doesn't really change all that much, right? Here we have a decrease of 60%, but now over these other intervening 7 hours we have a drop of maybe 10%, right? You would think it would be 0%, that we wouldn't remember anything, because after just 1 hour, we've already forgotten most of it. But what Ebbinghaus found is that with time, our forgetfulness starts to slow down. And then you can see how that changes from 24 hours later, 48 hours later, 120 hours, and 744 hours later. Asked about that phone number, people don't remember it very well, but they remember it about as well 120 hours as they did 744 hours. We'll talk more about that later, but this is just to show that this is an example of memory, right? That we can see that memory seems to, quote-unquote, get worse with time. Now, the problem with memory research, and one of the reasons why it's so hard to define, is because it's really hard to demonstrate that memories exist. And I know that sounds silly, but here's the thing. If I wanted to know if you had a memory, how would I do that? As a teacher, I do it all the time, right? Because tests and quizzes are an example of that. That we assume that if somebody does well on a quiz, it's because they've remembered all the important parts of that chapter, right? That's supposedly what it means. So that's me testing your memory. And if you do well, that means that you have memories for those things. And if you don't do well, it means you don't remember those things, right? But I don't know, y'all. I'm kind of wrestling with that because I'm a very skeptical person. And whenever I see that, I'm like, well, I didn't see your memory, right? I didn't hold your memory in my hand. I didn't see you take your memory out and mess with it. That memory is invisible. That memory lives somewhere up here, right? That memory's somewhere in the brain. And that maybe if we had like some really high-tech technology, like an MRI machine, maybe we could look inside the brain. But if I don't have that, then maybe I can't trust that you have a memory, right? So you can see how weird this is. That memories are really hard to measure because we can't directly measure them. We can't directly see them. I can't take your memory and measure it with a ruler. I can't take your memory and put it on a weight scale and determine how much it weighs. I can't take your memory and see how fast it runs, or how quickly it moves, how slowly it moves. So does that mean that memories are not testable, that they're not able to be measured? I think really it just means that we have to be careful, that we have to measure memory indirectly. So how do I know that you have a memory? Well, if we want to save time, I'm just going to ask you, do you have a memory, right? And you tell me yes, and then I would say, okay, well, prove it. And you would say, I can prove that I have a memory because I can tell you about that weirdo slime mold maze you made me watch a couple of minutes ago, right? So that would be an example of indirect presentation of memory, because what you're doing is you're showing me evidence that you have memory because you're telling me about something you remember. But some people are not convinced by that, right? A lot of really strict behaviorists, such like B.F. Skinner, for example, other people you may have learned about in applied behavior analysis or learning if you took those classes, some of them are maybe so skeptical that they would say, well, because I don't directly see your memory, because I can't directly measure memory, then I can't really talk about it in a scientific way. But I think that most researchers these days will agree that we can study memory, but the best that we can do is we can do it indirectly, so that we have to devise these other tests and protocols and measurements to try to find ways to determine if memory is good or bad, or the degree to which memory can be good or bad. This is referred to as the black box problem. The black box problem is a philosophical problem that is not just psychology, it's every discipline. It's a philosophical thing, so it transcends its discipline. But the black box problem is essentially that we all have brains. We know that things seem to get to our brain and that our brain controls our behavior, right? But we don't really know a lot of what's going on between those moments, from when our brain receives something and when it outputs something. And because we can't see it directly, that is the black box problem. Some people will then say, well, that means we may never know what's going on in the brain, and so therefore it's not a scientific question if we can never indirectly study it. But at least, and again, my perspective is from cognitive psychology, but really experimental psychology. My PhD is in experimental psychology, but they call it cognitive and behavioral sciences because it's a fancy way of talking about it. But experimental psychologists will generally agree, like, oh, well, we can get around the black box problem with a couple of ways. One is that we can use some super cool technology, right? We can use an MRI machine, and we can look at what's going on in the brain, and we can say, like, okay, this area right here, that's where memory is stored, and this is the area that is going to distribute memory across the cortex or whatever. So yeah, we might be able to use technology to peer inside this black box. Also, the reason why it's called the black box is because you can imagine, I'm going to go over this as an example, and if you took my cognitive psychology class, you may remember this, that you can have, like, let's say you have a machine, you feed a number 2 into that machine, and it gives you the number 4, right? So, what's going on in this machine? Well, you might say, okay, well, you're adding 2, right? So I'm putting 2 in there, and I'm getting out 4. But will I actually know? If I can say that it's impossible for me to open this up, how can I 100% be sure that no matter what, whenever I put in a number, is going to give me +2? The way that we can do that as researchers is that we can manipulate what this value is. And essentially what we're doing is we're going to manipulate that independent variable. So if this input isn't the independent variable, then we can manipulate it, we can change it up, we can form groups or we can form conditions around it so that maybe half of everybody's going to get 2, but some, other folks are going to get a 6. And so if that's the case, you put in a 6, and let's say that whenever you put that in, then you get a 36 out of the box. Ooh, so it looks like it's not just adding 2, that there's something else going on, right? And if you're clever, or if you've taken a couple of math classes recently, you probably can figure out what this is, right? That what you're doing, it might be that you are squaring it. So if you're squaring it, then that would give you 2 squared. 2 times 2 is 4. 6 times 6 is 36. So then we can say, like, okay, well, what's going on inside the black box is that you're just squaring it. But, again, if you're really, really skeptical, let's try something else. Let's put in -6, right? Let's say we put in -6, and it gives us -36. What the heck is that? Because you may remember that if you do -6 times -6, it's just going to give you +36, right? So therefore, -36 can't be, squaring it can't be what's going on in this box. Instead, it might be something like, maybe you're squaring it. Actually, no. The example, hold on. It's not that I'm squaring it. It's that maybe what you're doing is you have x, that's your input, and we're going to say that x multiplied by the negative version of what you have multiplied by -1 equals, and if you do that, then you could do 2 times -2 is -4, times -1 is going to give you 4, and then you do 6, so 6 times -6 is going to be -36, times -1 is going to be +36. You put in -6 here, -6, maybe this doesn't work. But the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that there could always be some kind of feature like this -1 and like this negative value here. There could be something else going on in this black box that we're not directly observing. Most researchers will say, that's okay, we can keep manipulating what numbers go into this black box. Then we can look at the relationship that the dependent variable or the output that this resulting value has, and we can try to understand that relationship by looking at how it varies when we manipulate the independent variable. And that's all research is, right? And we're talking about this in terms of psychology, but this is for every discipline. You can even think about this in the brain, that, if you want to know what the brain is doing, you're going to give somebody, a picture or whatever, have them look at it, then you're going to measure what's going on in the brain. Then you're going to show them a different picture, and you're going to, then see what's going on in the brain and see whether or not those pictures have a relationship to what changes are happening in the brain. So, in terms of memory, how this relates to memory just means that because I can't directly see your memory, that we have to be very careful about what we're putting in to this black box here. That we have to be very careful what kind of questions we're asking, because that is going to easily change the answer, and what we're ultimately trying to do is find the relationship between the input and the output, or the independent variable and that dependent variable, and that those mechanisms are inside our brain. And trust me, we're going to be looking at lots of examples of neuroimaging and using MRI or single cell electrode analysis to help us understand what components of the brain are responsible for memory. But we're even more broad than that right now. We're not even getting that nitty-gritty right now. So think about it like this. If we're measuring memory, then what we're doing is we're measuring the indirect components of memory, because we can't directly see memory. So here are a couple of ways that we can talk about memory and talk about how we measure it. So the first is recall. Recall is whenever I ask you to tell me something about that memory. So if I ask you, what'd you have for breakfast yesterday? That's an example of recall. You're generating the memory. Recognition, which is different than recall, but this is one of those things that, like people just don't, in the culture or whatever, when they're talking about this, they kind of lump recall and recognition together. We don't normally think about those two things as being separate processes. They're actually handled by different parts of the brain. We didn't know this 60 years ago, but we do know it now. Recognition is essentially recognizing or being able to match your memory to a choice that is presented in front of you. So again, and I'm going to give you examples for breakfast here, because let's just use your memory for breakfast for all of these different ways that we can ask about it. So if I gave you 2 flashcards, one that had a bowl of cereal and then one that had eggs and bacon, and I asked you, which of these did you have for breakfast? That's an example of recognition, because what you're doing is you're matching your memory to one of those choices. Next, we have an implicit test. An implicit test is a non-conscious way of talking about memory. This is a little bit harder to talk about at this point in the semester because we haven't really talked about what non-conscious memory looks like. But this would be like, this is going to be a bad example, but like if, let's say that you had bacon and eggs for breakfast yesterday, and if I showed it to you now, and you started salivating, then I might conclude that you like eggs and bacon and that you had it kind of recently because your body is exhibiting that it knows the taste of it and that it's craving it. That's an example of an implicit test. Is that the best way to determine what you have for breakfast? No. But that's just an example of how not all of these are good for this. All of these measurements have their strengths and weaknesses. That there are certain questions that these methods work better on than others. What about source judgment? A source judgment question would be like, where did you have breakfast yesterday? If you're doing that, then you're not just saying what the memory was, but you're saying where you acquired it, where that memory was formed, and that is a source judgment. And then finally, we have meta-memory judgments. And meta-memory is just essentially a memory of a memory. It's you being aware of your own memory. So if you are aware of your own memory, or if you understand that you have a memory for something, that is a meta-memory judgment. So if I asked you, what do you remember better? What you had for breakfast today or what you had for breakfast yesterday? That is a meta-memory judgment because you are comparing 2 separate memories and speaking to their attributes. If you've ever said, hey, my memory is bad, that's a meta-memory judgment because you are aware of your own memory and reacting to it. You don't need to know all these just now. So if you are furiously writing these things down, that's okay. Don't worry too much about it. We'll talk about each of these as the semester goes on. Don't worry, we're kind of winding down here. We're getting into the final stretch. So here is an example of each of those memory tests and how we might use them as an indirect method to look at memory. So if I were to say, what is her birthday? That is an example of recall because they have to generate that memory. So if they say July 10th, 1998, that is an example of somebody generating that memory. That memory is stored around here somewhere and they have to recall it. They have to retrieve it. If they got this right, then I would say, yes, they do have a memory, right? Because they were able to show that they remember something. So even though I can't see them physically draw that memory out of their brain, they're showing evidence that they remember it, and that is essentially how researchers try to get around the black box problem, by using these indirect methods to understand the relationship that these questions have on what we remember. All right, so maybe we don't want to just rely on recall. We can find other ways to change these questions up. This is, so maybe instead of just asking what is her birthday, we could ask something like, what was your last birthday like? And if you say, hey, it was, I don't know, I ate at Chuck E. Cheese's, and I had pizza there. Hopefully that's not how you spent your 21st birthday. Actually, Do they sell alcohol at Chuck E. Cheese? Is Chuck E. Cheese even around? Did it get shut down during the COVID pandemics? I don't know. Hopefully you're not going there on your 21st birthday getting drunk. But honestly, that actually might sound fun. Just getting drunk, assuming there's no kids there. And I say this as somebody, I don't drink. But you're playing skee ball, you're playing Miss Pac-Man or whatever the arcade games are there, and you're watching the mechanical robot band play and you're having some greasy pizza. That kind of sounds like a good time. In this case, you are still relying on recall, right? Because you're generating what that memory was. But we can change this up. So if I were to say, is this her birthday? July 1st, 1998. And you said, no, that's an example of, oh, you don't remember this. Because that was actually, my bad. The example on the last slide was July 10th, right? So this person is accurately showing that they do have a memory for the correct date. That would be an example of a recognition task. An example of an implicit task would be if I said, can you show me how to tie your shoes? And then you just immediately, without thinking about it too hard, just showed me how to tie your own shoes. That would be an example of an implicit question because it doesn't require conscious processing for you to do it. You can do that in your sleep pretty much. And then we have source judgments, which would be, how did you know it was her birthday? In that case, you could say, I saw a notification about it on social media or whatever. That's an example of a source judgment. You remember where you got that information. So it's not just that you remember the information, but you remember the context for that information and where it came from. And then finally, we have metamemory. And in metamemory, it would be like if I asked you, are you forgetting whose birthday it is? And then you stop and you say, no, I don't think so. That's an example of metamemory because you are aware of your own memory. You know whether or not you have forgotten something. This can also work the other way, where if I asked you, hey, do you remember who the first president of the United States is? And if you said yes, that's an example of metamemory because you're thinking about, okay, I do remember the first president. That is George Washington. And so, yes, I do have that memory. You're making an assessment about your own memory. That makes it a metamemory. So we've been talking about this black box where I can't really see the memory inside of it moving around or you acting upon it. But using neuroimaging and using other neuroscience techniques, we do have a pretty good idea about some of the key characters at play for memory. The one that I want to draw your attention to for now is going to be the hippocampus. We'll be talking about almost all of these, though, as the semester goes on. But the hippocampus is kind of the big player. It's the one that gets talked about and singled out a lot as kind of being a seat, a S-E-A-T of memory. That this is where memory lives. It's where it spends its days. The truth is much more complex than that. But yes, the hippocampus does have a very crucial role in memory. It's just not the only piece. Every part of our brain has some hand in memory. It just depends on what kind of memory you're talking about. This is why, and I should have given you a heads up because it's disgusting. If you're a little bit squeamish, maybe fast forward 30 seconds so you don't hear me explain what that was. All right. What you're looking at right here is a hippocampus. This was part of somebody donated their brain to science, and those scientists carved out their hippocampus. It's disgusting. But hey, this is medical research, and this is why it's called a hippocampus, because it looks like a seahorse. And so I want to say that, and I could be wrong about this, but that the Latin translation for hippocampus roughly translate to horse of the sea, or horse that moves in sea, or something like that. And this because it looks like a because it looks like a seahorse. That is how it got its name. But this is going to be one of the most important parts of the brain that we're going to be talking about all semester, because this is the seat of memory. And you can find that little guy right there. How cute, right? So we know where it is because in tasks like this, people will say, hey, tell me about what you had for breakfast yesterday, and then we scan their brain while they're thinking about it, and then we can isolate and say, all right, this is the part of their brain that is active when they are retrieving a memory or when they are storing a memory or something like that. But that is only true for certain kinds of memory. As we're going to see, that is true mostly for explicit memory, but not true for implicit memory. Explicit memory, we got a lot of hippocampus going on right here. Not so much with the implicit stuff, but that's okay. We'll talk about that a lot in a couple of units. All right, so the long-term memory here, a lot of what we think about as memory is long-term memory. Thinking about what you have for breakfast is an example long-term memory, and we can split that up into two separate sections, into explicit memory and implicit memory. And if you look at the course calendar, you'll see that coming pretty soon, we're going to have units dedicated just to explicit memory and just to implicit memory. But I wanted us to see, for example, that even within explicit memory, we have episodic memories and we have semantic memories. If you're thinking about yourself and where you were when you did something, that is episodic. Sometimes people call this autobiographical memory. I don't love that for reasons that we'll talk about later this semester, but it's kind of a nice, easy way to remember it. Semantic memory is just kind of like trivia. So if you could tell me who the first president of the United States is, or when or where did George Washington live, that's an example of semantic memory. You may not remember exactly where you were when you learned that stuff, but you do remember it, and so that makes it semantic. If we look over here on the other side, implicit memory is roughly just non-conscious memory, and that's going to include things like classical conditioning, so like taste aversions, or any other kind of learning. It's also going to be able to involve things like motor memory, so skills and things like learning how to play an instrument. And you can see that we can take implicit memory and we can break it down pretty, into these smaller buckets as well. And we'll be talking about all of these pieces as the semester wears on. So you can think of this right here as our roadmap that we are starting right here. And next unit, we're still going to stay here. And then after that, we're going to come check this out. And then we're going to come over here and check this out. And then we're going to go over here. And then we're going to go over here. And then over here. And then we're going to come back over here. And then we're going to probably come back over here. So that's the roadmap. How fun is that? The last thing that I wanted to tell you is two last things. The next unit that we're going to be talking about is the forgetting curve. We're going to talk a lot about Ebbinghaus because he coined this idea of the forgetting curve and how memory follows a universal function no matter what the species is, that all memory follows a set of certain rules. And we'll talk about what those rules are in the next unit. But I wanted to run something by you. We're not going to be able to do this as an activity. But if you've ever played the game of telephone, then you have seen how tricky and how malleable memory is, how fallible it is. The game of telephone is pretty simple. You may have done this as, in a class growing up, or maybe even at a party as like a fun way to pass time. The idea is that you give somebody a message, and that person has to whisper it in the ear of someone else, and that person has to whisper it in the ear of someone else, and that person has to whisper it in the ear of the next person, and that person has to whisper it into the ear of the next person, so on and so forth, until you get back to the final person, and that person says out loud what the message was, and almost always it's very, very different from what the initial message was. I remember whenever I first did this game in a classroom in like 4th or 5th grade, I remember that the message was like, it was a full sentence, and it was not hard to remember. It was something like, the boy went to the grocery store to get some milk and eggs, something like that. And then by the time we got to the end of the classroom, they thought the message was, the last person said, the message I got was Happy Father's Day. So somewhere along the line of these 20 kids, the message, went from the boy went to the grocery store to get eggs and milk or eggs and bacon or whatever. See, I already forgot. I would have told the next person the wrong thing. Slowly that message would slowly get more and more corrupted and messed up as it passed from person to person, so that by the end it was totally unrecognizable. And that actually turns out to be a really, really good metaphor for how our brain works, whether or not we like to believe it or not. That the more we think about something and the more we remember an event, the more likely it is to be distorted and to be flawed. But that, my friends, is a topic for a totally different unit, but something fun to think about. And if you have a chance, try this out. With if you got 3 or 4, no, let's say 5 or 6 friends, try it out. It's kind of fun and silly and easy, and it'll show you a lot about how our memory works and how bad it actually is. And maybe that's a good place to stop this this video lecture by just saying, hey, memory is bad, and we're going to be talking about it more this semester. Thank you so much for hanging out. And if you have any questions at all, or even if you want to say, hey, wait a second, is that slime mold stuff, is that actually memory? And you want to have a conversation about it, send me an email. tdaniel@westfield.ma.edu. tdaniel@westfield.ma.edu. Let me know what you think if you have any questions. And I will see you later. Bye-bye, everybody. Oops, this is not it. This is it. See ya.